Thank you for joining me, Mike. I appreciate you. It's good to see you.
Good, you too, Melissa.
So, Mike, you've been in IT now for about 30 years as an industry leader in IT. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your background.
Oh man, so it's changed over the years, but for the most part, it's dealing with infrastructure, a little bit of IT leadership, but mainly centers around the infrastructure components, especially in my last 7 or 8 years. But I've touched everything from EMR to ERP software, and always find my way back to Cisco, Microsoft, and running infrastructure.
Gotcha. You and I have talked about this, and particularly one of the areas that I wanted to talk to you about today was disaster recovery, which is something you're passionate about. So I would love to get some information for you. So for those watching who might not even know what disaster recovery is, how do you put that in simple layman terms for people?
Quite simply, bad things happen, and you're expected to know what to do next.
And if you don't have a disaster recovery plan in place, that can be a disaster in and of itself.
Absolutely. It's great when times are good, but as soon as something bad happens, if you're not prepared, everything goes south real quick. So you have to have a plan in place. You have to have at least, know what you need to recover, what the important parts of your business are that need to get online quick. And a business assessment will determine what your DR/business continuity plans will be.
So what is the difference then between disaster recovery and business continuity?
Okay, so disaster recovery is really, I view it more from an IT perspective as recovering systems to allow business operations to happen. Business continuity is a little different. IT systems are IT systems, but if something happens to a location, where are people going to work out of? Business continuity is keeping up operations no matter what the situation is. When I was working during Hurricane Sandy, our main offices were closed for one was 7 days, one was 10 days. We had no access to the offices. So we were operating out of different areas. That's continuing business operations. That's not simply restoring a server and saying, okay, we're good to go.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. So can a backup alone protect a business, like during a disaster recovery or a ransomware?
Maybe. It depends what that backup consists of. There's a lot of thought goes into it, and the key is thinking about what could happen and what you have to do. Unfortunately, there's so many different scenarios. You just naming a couple that you have to be prepared for. Then they're not all the same. Ransomware. People think, oh, okay. Our files are encrypted. Let's just restore from last night or this morning, and we're good to go. But that's not always the case. A lot of times, the bad actors get on your network and start encrypting files without you even knowing, and your backups alone aren't enough to restore them. Not everybody's looking at all the data every day.
So what in a situation like that do you do?
Backup system that goes back, to certain points in time in the past. It's not just, keep a week backup and everything's good. You have to have mutable backups where the bad actors can't go in and destroy your backup so you can't restore. A big thing about ransomware is they're trying to lock all your data, so you have to pay to unlock it. So if you have backup copies that are not encrypted or not destroyed, you don't necessarily need to pay the ransom to unlock your files.
But they still have your files, which leads to its own set of complications, right?
Yeah, maybe they downloaded files, maybe not. You don't know. Them having access to your data is a different set of problems. Trying to sell it, depending on what it is. But getting business operations back up is, another issue.
Right, yeah, for sure. They always say the first hour determines the future of how you move forward. So what should happen in the first hour of say, a ransomware attack when it comes to disaster recovery?
Well, the first hour is people talking to each other, trying to figure out what happened, what you're up against, where the issue is. How do you stop it from happening at that moment? Can you stop it? Is it too late? If you have a disaster recovery and business continuity plan in place, you should have a playbook. You should know a little bit about what your next steps are. So it's important to have that on paper. You have to know what your options are, what you're going to do, what the best step forward is.
Some people just put a disaster recovery plan in place and they never look at it again and say in 2 years from now they have an incident. And I'm like, first of all, they don't even know where their disaster recovery plan is, or they haven't looked at it in a year or two and they have no idea what the actual steps are. So how often should you revisit that and actually run it through and test it out?
Well, when I was in financial, we would test it to an extent every month. We would have a full scale test every year. That's pretty important to do. You have to set your definition of what a full scale test entails. It doesn't mean rebuild a whole network somewhere else and operate off of it. The testing part means something different to everybody. A file restore is good maybe once a month. You try to restore a whole database, a whole working application, a whole location, back to services. So some people take it as actually going to your disaster recovery plan, enabling DR systems in production, which I'm not a big fan of, because that's essentially creating the disaster during testing. I don't necessarily like to see that, but as long as it's depending on your situation, if it's a controlled recovery, and you're very confident it's going to work, okay, there's different levels to testing, but be careful about creating your own disaster during testing.
Have you seen that in action?
Luckily, not under me. However, I do know about that. Whether it was old companies or friends in the industry. I take other people's experiences very. I take it to heart. It could happen to anybody, so you learn from it. The best thing to learn from is actual experiences. You could hear things that vendors will always come up with certain scenarios but when it happens in real life, it kind of hits home because it could always be you, and you have to learn from fortunately other people's mistakes sometimes to prevent your own. So
Yeah, that is true.
yeah.
So with there being different environments, you have cloud, then you have hybrid, and then you have on-prem. How does that change your DR plan?
In the plan, you have to know what you're protecting, how you're protecting it, what disasters do you expect. The cloud comes with a different set of disasters. The war over in the Middle East, AWS data center was hit with a missile. So you have to be able to recover from a data center going completely offline. Did you have, just because you're in the cloud doesn't mean you can't have a disaster. It's not, you still have to prepare there. You have to have clouds maybe in different regions with failover. You still have to have disaster recovery in place for your cloud environments. That doesn't protect you simply being on the cloud, whether it's Google, Azure, AWS. You're not protected simply because you have a server out there.
Right. And so with that being said, there's probably numerous people within an IT team, within any organization, that should be part of putting together this disaster recovery plan, because they may think of different things in their role that somebody else would not think of in a different role, and things get missed, right?
Yeah, that's very accurate, because you also shouldn't rely on IT people only to put together that plan. IT people are thinking systems, but the business, it has to use all the systems together to make operations continue. An IT person will be looking at it, a server, but in reality, the business knows which ones are important. You have, if a disaster happens, you're on a timeline to recover everything. You have to know which servers to recover first, which servers in what order, which ones are more, which ones are the most important, and the time it takes to recover. You can't just go at it haphazardly and pick up where you want and start doing things. There's a priority involved.
It's different depending on every organization and industry. But how much downtime can a company really afford, right, comes into that as well, because a smaller company, a mom and pop, might be able to afford a few hours, whereas a tremendous retailer, they're going to have problems within the first 5-10 minutes. They got people that are mad at them now, and they can't reach people, and systems are down. So what does that look like typically?
Well, a lot of it comes down to budget. How much are
Hmm.
you willing to spend to recover? How quickly? The bigger companies might have a real-time data protection program. It's not feasible for some small companies. You have to have the bandwidth in the back end. It's important to have copies of your data in different locations. To have them in different locations, well, how long does it take to get to that other location? Is it writing data real time as the business day happens? Because you can't plan when a disaster happens. It could come at 11 o'clock, in the middle of business. It could come on a weekend when maybe hopefully not much is going on, or it's a 24/7 company and operations are happening all the time. A lot of IT tasks run overnight on the weekends off hours. So things
Right.
are always happening. It comes down to budget. You have to have the bandwidth in place. I want to say the most popular option I go back to is near real time,
Mhm.
where your key servers are replicated to another location, but at maybe a 15-minute, 30-minute delay, because you have to have the bandwidth in place to do it. If you do real time, you might run into trouble if other things are happening on your network. So it's important that you understand how you're replicating, how you're backing up data, and what your options are.
So then for a smaller company that doesn't have the budget to put that in place, or they don't have the bandwidth, an ideal way for them to protect themselves, ProTech, for example, we do co-managed services. So this way, if they don't have the bandwidth and something happens, like say at 2 o'clock in the morning, they're not relying on somebody to come in the morning and see a ticket and hopefully acknowledge it because it's already been dealt with in the middle of the night by, say, ProTech.
Yeah, no, you absolutely, sometimes it's absolutely best to rely on a third party. If you can't afford a whole infrastructure to protect your environment, you can rely on third parties. There's different options. There's management of your backups. There's hosting offsite of your backups. Again, it comes down to what do you expect? What is the disaster? Is it a fire in your data center and you don't have anything there? Because if that's the case, a lot of virtualization platforms have snapshots where
Mhm.
you could take snapshots regularly and recover from that. But if there's a fire in your data center and the servers go up in smoke, you don't have those snapshots anymore on those servers. You have to go to an off-site backup. You need a place to recover to. If the equipment's not there, where are you going to recover to? Do you have another infrastructure? Do you rely on a vendor's cloud to to recover, or what's in place? So again, comes back to budget, comes back to uh, what do you want to protect? What portions of your network do you want to protect? And that comes from the business decisions.
What would you say to people that are not necessarily tech savvy and they're thinking, watching this, well, I want to protect everything. Shouldn't everything be protected?
Uh, sure. I just if you have enough money for it, I mean, it makes an IT person's job much easier if you protect everything real time in other locations and it's easy to spin up. It becomes a little harder. If you expect disasters to happen regularly, yeah, protect against them, protect it, at a high level. You have to think about it. If you expect it to happen once every 5, 6, 7 years, the decisions come down to, can you afford to lose 4 hours of data, 8 hours of data? What can you afford to lose? Can you rebuild the transactions that happened during that time? A lot of people set their backups, set a nightly backup and don't think about it. But guess what? If something happens at 4 p.m., you still have a whole business day of data that didn't get backed up. That's gone forever. So how do you recreate
Yeah.
it? Can you dare I say paperwork, but is there a way to recreate the transactions? Are they gone forever? Are your financial systems never going to be the same? So you have to think about all that. So the solutions in place aren't just one type of backup and move on. You need immutable backups to protect against the ransomware, where the bad actors can't encrypt certain backups. So you don't have to worry, if they're on the network, there's certain backups they can't get to. There's different options, and it's usually a combination of those options that that put together a good disaster recovery plan.
Makes perfect sense. Outside of the IT team, you mentioned that there should be other people involved from the business standpoint of putting together a DR plan. Who in an organization should be involved in that?
Every department that relies on IT systems to work. So, if you're in a bank, you have branches that need to work. There's all the internal departments, whether it's HR, service, there's a bunch, depending on the line of business, there's all different departments that need, that need information systems for different reasons. And some of them could go without systems for a few hours, maybe a day. A lot of times DR plans don't just involve IT system recovery. Maybe if you're in a medical facility, the nurses and business doesn't stop. Nurses
Right.
and doctors might have to go to paper records. Do you have a printout of medication administration records and treatment administration records that you have to go to in the event of a disaster? How up to date are they? Every scenario has to be accounted for.
So everyone within the organization on a leadership role really owns the DR.
Everyone owns it. If you leave it to IT people, they're not always going to think about what's important to the business. They're going to think about what they can recover the quickest, maybe. So there's different thinking, and it's expected. So it comes down to the business, what it needs. The business has to figure out what the recovery point objectives are. How long they could go without certain data. If you have 200 servers, it's also not feasible to recover 200 servers in an hour.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
unless you spend the money for an infrastructure where you can, that it's not feasible. So you have to decide, figure out what your capabilities are. And you might come down to, well, these 10 servers are critical to get online in the first hour. Then these next 30 servers are critical in 4 hours. These other servers are IT functions on the back end that people may not get, maybe web filtering or other back end systems that are less important, overall, they could wait a day. So everything has to be timed. It has to be scheduled. When can you bring systems back online?
I guess it really boils down to, like you said, like having the budget to really protect yourself. But what people need to understand also, when you have IT that speaks tech, and then you have finance that speaks numbers. And a lot of times they don't meet in the middle because they don't speak each other's language. So getting people to understand that, yes, you're going to use budget to put these things in place, but the repercussions of not having that can cost you financially a lot more than if you had put precautionary things in place.
Yeah, absolutely. There's different ways. Do you buy an infrastructure? Do you rent it from a provider? What do you do? But make sure that it gets your data back when you need it. If the business can't operate, a lot of times the business can figure out how much it costs to be down a day without systems. How much does it cost to be down a day without these specific systems? What is it going to cost the business? In some cases, if a business is down a week, it might put them out of business. So it's an insurance policy. You pay for insurance, you pay for fire insurance, whatever. You have to think about your data too, and it's not as easy as just paying Allstate to write a policy to recover, to pay you money if something bad happens. You have to get things back online.
Do you think that most teams are prepared for a disaster, in your opinion?
Absolutely not, because you could put everything on paper. I question all the time is how detailed are the plans that are on paper? Is it spelled out where a level 1 tech can execute them and has permissions to execute them? With Hurricane Sandy, you saw that not all techs were reachable. Cell phone service was down. You couldn't get to people. People couldn't travel. So you're working with partial staff to recover. What staff is that going to be? You don't know in a disaster if there's a blackout. I remember I was part of a blackout I don't remember, maybe about 20 years ago in Manhattan. And I remember driving over the bridge, looked eerie, and all of a sudden I realized all the traffic lights were out and my company is calling me, and I'm like, well, I can't exactly get back to work.
Yeah.
It's gridlock at every intersection. I can only do what I can remotely. We had a backup generator to keep things going, but I can only do so much away from the company. Luckily, I forgot how long we were down for, but the generator lasted that long. If it didn't last that long, I can't even begin to predict what would have happened.
I actually remember that blackout that you're talking about because I was there in the city
Yeah,
and somebody started a rumor that there was a terrorist attack and like
of
everybody was
course.
like in a panic and I'm in the middle of a sea of people that are all having a nervous breakdown and I'm short and I was like, God, get me out of here. But that's a good point. You can't reach people. So what do you do? So what do you do? Let's say that generator did not last as long as that blackout did. What do you do?
Well, I could tell you what I did do for Hurricane Sandy because my companies had no power. I had 15 people working in my living room, my own living room,
Really?
connecting to our data center that we put online, that we made sure was 100% ready the day before because we were expecting a possibility of a power outage.
Hmm.
So it turned out we actually rented space in a hotel. It cost us, but we had space for people to convene, the ones that we can. We got mail delivery of all our checks from the post office directly. We would process them. I had power strips for everybody to charge their cell phones and laptops at
Wow.
my table. Yeah, it was absolutely crazy. So we ended up getting three locations. I think we had a total of maybe 30, a third, maybe a quarter of the company working
Wow.
at the time. And we kept business operations going. So it
You
was an
know,
international business.
it's a good point that you bring this up because when people hear disaster recovery, they automatically tend to think ransomware attack
Yeah.
or bad actor, right? But they're not thinking about natural disasters or just other things that happen. There's, like you said earlier, there's a million things
Mhm.
that could potentially go wrong, right?
Yeah.
And so it's not only about protecting yourself from, bad actors and things like that. It's thinking ahead like you did in that situation to make sure that you guys are online, even if it was just a quarter of the team.
Yeah, exactly. And at the time, you didn't know which quarter of the team you were going to get in touch with. Not
Yeah,
everybody was accessible. Some people, will obviously prioritize their family safety. If they have no power in their house, they're not rushing back to work to,
right.
to handle company issues. So you don't know who you're going to get. You don't know who's around. You don't know what's truly going to happen in a disaster. You don't know what the disaster is. I mean, a disaster for a company might be as simple as one server going down and losing a key business system. It might be, a small scale like that as opposed to a whole data center being offline.
And it doesn't need to be a whole data center being offline in order for it to have a significant impact on the business.
Yep, correct.
It could be something
Correct.
small, but that
Yeah,
small thing could amount to catastrophic
yeah.
consequences.
Yeah, and a lot of, I've had systems over the years. I've had a virtualized infrastructure for a while, but I've still had other systems that ran on their own. You have to look, do you have extra hard drives on site? Do you have an extra motherboard? Do you have an extra system you could go to? Things fail. They fail over time. So you have to have enough protections in place where you can recover quickly. Are parts available easily for those servers? If they're not, you better have a shelf of parts.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, because you could have something with a lead time of 6 to 8 weeks, and then what?
Yeah. After COVID, the supply chains got completely disrupted. The major companies, I ran into a problem. I was expanding an office. I think this was in 2020. This was in late 2020 after COVID, people working from home. So I had to expand a switch stack, to make room for another 50 people to come in the office. Well, they couldn't get that model Cisco switch. Cisco was on back order for 9 months. Why were they on back order?
Oh,
Because when you can't buy something, when it comes back in stock, people buy extra. So
that's
the
true.
the problem became exponential because all the big banks, the big companies, as soon as Cisco were able to produce these switches, they would buy thousands. They would buy as much as they can get to keep on their shelves to prevent this from happening again. So I couldn't get this model switch. I had to go to a different model switch and put it together, to allow my company to expand when we needed to.
You know what that reminds me of? It reminds me of you might get snow in the South and everybody
Yeah.
buys all the milk and the eggs and the bread and everything's bare bones empty.
And the
Same
toilet
thing.
paper.
And the
Yeah.
toilet paper, that's all right. That's true though. That's a good point. If you can't get the parts you need when you finally can, you are probably going to stock up, and that just puts a weight and a burden on everyone else. That is a
Yeah.
big burden to bear too.
Yeah, it's a big burden, and people don't realize it. When times are good, and you could, and the buyer has the power. It's very easy to say, "Oh, I'll just get another server. I'll just do this. I'll just do that." But when you can't, you still have to plan for that too. I mean, even recently, I went to order a couple servers. Talk to Dell, Supermicro, and I'm realizing that there's lead times. Why? Because the memory, they can't get the memory. They can't get certain components now because it's in demand because of all the AI data centers. So
Hmm.
I'm like, wow, you mean to tell me on a server I could get in 2 weeks, now I have to wait 3 months. So yeah, you have to plan
Yeah.
accordingly. That you can consider that a little disaster for some companies if they can't get what they need to do business.
Yeah, and 3 months is a long time. Like even being down for 4 hours is a long time, let alone having to wait three
Yeah,
months.
yeah,
That's a really long time, right?
yeah.
So, and the bare bones minimum when it comes to an organization, regardless of size, it could be SMB, mid-market, enterprise. What is the bare bones minimum that every business should be backing up at least daily, or if they can't do it, like you said, every 15 minutes or whatever the case may be?
Well, okay, so the minimum is you really need an offsite backup, a reliable offsite backup. You need to back up the data that changes. You might have some old systems. Let's say you have a terabyte of data sitting there that doesn't change often. It's more historical. Well, you don't have to prioritize the backup of that data every night. Maybe you could do that weekly, depending on what your limitations are. So you have to focus on the day-to-day data that changes, that's important to you, and make sure that comes over. Not everybody replicates their systems near real time. Maybe they do an offsite backup once a week, to a cloud.
Hmm.
You have to be willing to lose that data in an extreme disaster. And then what people forget about too is, so a lot of people will use AWS or Azure data storage. Well, have you thought about how long it takes to retrieve that data in a disaster? Microsoft and Amazon, they throttle downloads depending on what level of service you buy in the cloud. So if you have terabytes of data in the cloud and you're saying, "Oh, we're covered," well, have you timed how long it takes to retrieve that data to restore to your systems? It might take you weeks to get that data down. You have to factor that in your recovery plans.
I didn't even realize that. So, depending on the plan that you have, the recovery time could be significantly impacted because the data transfer is so slow.
Hmm. Yep.
So, in a disaster situation, say you have one of those plan levels that it's like, turtle slow, can you upgrade in a disaster situation to be able to do it faster, or are you kind of stuck with what you have?
Yeah, at that time, I mean, I don't know that Microsoft or Amazon is going to jump and have somebody change your plans instantly.
Yeah.
Maybe you can, but unless you put it in place, you can't rely on that happening quickly. So yeah, so pay attention to data retrieval. Pay attention, to what it takes to get back online completely. Again, if you have to replace equipment because you need a place to restore it to, what's the lead time on that equipment? It's not out of the realm to have to jump on eBay and buy used equipment temporarily if you could get it there the next day. It's you have to take everything into account. You have to document what the potential disasters are, what the probability of those disasters are, and see what the budget allows you to prepare for.
When it comes to this particular type of preparation, what do you think is the biggest budget constraint? Where does the budget go from like here to here because you've implemented X, Y, or Z in this type of plan.
The biggest thing is the recovery point objective. How long does it take you to recover? So you could say, well, I have a data center, I have a backup offsite. Do I just replace all my equipment that burned to the ground and then recover? Will that take a month to do? Well, if you say you need it in a day, well, you have to have the equipment available. Do you use a cloud platform and spin up servers in the cloud and then have to deal with the networking components? Do you put it in place now so it's easy to restore to and pay? There's costs to having a cloud environment stage. So you have to weigh all of that. There's a lot of options, but your budget ultimately determines. Like you said at the beginning of our talk, if you're a small business, do you have that kind of budget that these enterprises have? You probably don't. You have to think about what you can put in place. Years ago, we used to have somebody dumping a backup in a car and taking it to their home. That was the off-site backup. I mean, think about all the things that could happen and what could go wrong and what the risks are. But that was again 30 years ago almost. So times have changed. The risk, your level of risk, your risk appetite has changed. Cars get broken into, things happen. How safe is somebody's home to store data?
Do they have kids and dogs that are going to be right? Like that's also a very important question. Frank, you have kids and dogs. You're not taking the drive.
Yeah. So it depends what your budget is, what your capabilities are. Maybe small business owners do throw it in their bag and go home at night with a physical backup. There's a lot of data services. If it's not a tremendous amount of data, you can back it up. Back it up to the cloud, which is great. It's a different medium to back up to. That should hopefully be sufficient for a lot of small businesses. But again, just factor in the time to recovery, and hopefully, with the options out there, you should be able to put together a plan that will work.
Right. Well, one of the things that I think too is that when it comes to smaller teams, you might have one person that manages IT, but they're not maybe experienced tremendously in any particular area. They know a little bit of everything. But then something like this comes along and they have no idea what to do. And then they have no team. They have nobody really assisting them to do that, which is where that's one of the things, obviously, again, that ProTech can help with. But during that time frame where you have this one person managing this entire environment and now you have a disaster, if they don't have somebody to call, that clock is ticking.
Absolutely. You need a backup. You can't rely on one person for any reason. A person can resign. You might have only 2 weeks with that person. Maybe they're on vacation because, hey, people go away. There's so many things that could happen. So if you're running a business, if the business is important to you, you need an alternative company or person to depend on. That vendors are great to use for that. Make sure they're trained, they understand your environment, and are able to jump in a pinch. Another measure of protection, but you can't rely on one person.
No, for anything, really. And I've seen that a handful of times where it's like, but we have you. That's what you're here for, right? And then the poor people are like, oh my gosh, like, yes, but I also have 900, 800 things outside of this that I'm responsible for, and there's one of me. So having a team, even if it's an external team that works as an extension of your team, can go a really long way.
Yeah, especially, do you stop recovery plans because, it's getting late, they have to eat dinner and go to bed and and come back and start again in the morning? Or do you have that company on standby that can work 24/7 with different people to jump in and help and continue the recovery process?
I'm sure that I think I already know what you're going to say, but there's not really one particular disaster that people in organizations see more often than others, is there?
No, right now with the crypto locker, the ransomware, I think that's getting very that has been very popular lately. That might be the biggest disaster they're seeing, which is crazy because when you think of disaster, you think of something physical. You think of terrorism, you think of power grids, you think of fire, you think of earthquakes. I mean, you see it on the news. I mean, think about if your business was in the disaster zone for any of that, what would happen to you? So there's all the different disasters you have to think about. So if you have a comprehensive plan and different backups in place in different regional areas, different ways to restore, then you're probably, you're in better shape than most. A lot of people don't think about that. They have maybe they thought about it enough to have an offsite backup, but not the recovery part, and the equipment and the facilities that entails.
It's kind of like one of the things that you think of on hindsight when you're in the midst of it. Like, why didn't we have this outlined that if something were to happen, we would follow these steps? And now what are we supposed to do? So to your point, again, it's that proactive approach to make sure that if something happens, that you know what to do. And you can't anticipate every possible scenario. Like, that's impossible. But certain scenarios probably would mimic each other in the recovery process. So even if the disaster that happens is caused by something you didn't see coming, the recovery process might still very much be the same, right?
It might be the same, but there's other factors that go into it too. With ransomware, you can't just say, "Oh, I have ransomware," and then start your recovery process and then get infected again because you didn't thoroughly clean your network and rid yourself of the infection. So the plan can't even go into your plan. Your recovery process can't even come into play until you're ready for it. Which brings up actually another thing. A lot of companies, I think they might be frozen when a disaster happens. You have to assess the disaster and figure out what the next steps are. And it requires business leaders to do that. By starting a disaster recovery process, you have to understand what that means. A lot of disaster recovery processes set up the network in a different location. You have to be prepared for, you could fail over, but you also have to be prepared to fail back at some point too. So you might be working on a temporary infrastructure for a period of time, and that has to go into your plans also. The full recovery, the failback portion of it.
That's a good point. What do you think is the biggest thing that people miss when they put together a disaster recovery plan?
Honestly, they probably miss the types of disasters that can happen. Aside from that is, the testing. Just because you're backing up a server, our transactions happening in the middle of the backup, they don't always understand that some of the data is not recoverable. It depends when the last backup took place, and they're not really thinking about that.
Like you said earlier, like if they're only backing up overnight and something happens at 4:00, everything from last night to 4:00 is not going to be something that they can recover because it wasn't backed up.
Correct.
But they're as an end user, maybe they're thinking, oh, well, we can just recover it, pull it back from an earlier time, not realizing that earlier time doesn't exist. The earliest time was last night.
Yeah, correct. So you have to pay attention to when the backups are happening. Like I said, if you have important servers, are they backed up near real time? Are they backed up at different points in the day? My backups aren't all the same. It depends on the servers. Some might be twice a day because we determined that we can lose 4 hours of data. So maybe I back it up at 6 p.m. and then again at noon after half a business day. So, and like I said, the most important servers are backed up near real time with maybe 15 to 30 minutes before the next backup point. So you could still lose 15 minutes of data that way. So,
sure, but 15 minutes is definitely better than 20 hours or 24 hours.
Correct.
So what is the obstacle with backing it up, say, every 15 minutes, like all of your data? Is it that it slows productivity down? It slows the system down? Is that the biggest aspect?
Yeah, that's the big factor. It's going to take some resources. It's going to take bandwidth because you're moving a lot of data. So it's going to use, if you're backing up a virtualized infrastructure, it's going to use the same NICs, the same network connections that data is flowing over. I mean, it depends on how many network connections you provision for it. I remember I set up on my firewall, I provisioned one ISP circuit to do my offsite backup because we were backing up servers every 15 minutes, a couple of the critical ones. So I reserved one ISP circuit for the backup. I used instead of using a fiber low latency circuit, I used a cable circuit, which was a backup ISP for us. But I programmed my firewall to use that to go to my backup data center to transmit data.
Did that help not slow things down by doing it that way?
Yes, correct. I mean, it still puts a little bit of load on your firewall. The firewall
Sure.
can only handle so much bandwidth at a time, but as long as your business operations function, you're okay. You have to make sure the firewall size right, your bandwidth is sized right, your company's, the data flow that your company requires to do business. So everything is resources, money, and what you want to do. In a virtualized infrastructure, I will say, I love Nutanix. The snapshot function is very efficient. But to give you an example, I remember one night, actually, I knew some work was going on a database. And luckily, the DBA said, hey, I'm going to be doing some work tonight. So I triggered a snapshot before he started. And then I get a call, hey, Mike, can you restore the server? I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, well, I locked myself out. I can't get back into it. So that was great. We took the precautions. We knew what the risks were, and we had to restore a full SQL server because we were locked out of it otherwise. So we didn't lose any data because we knew we were doing work and we planned appropriately.
Everything comes back to that same concept. Plan ahead. Be prepared for the worst. Hope for the best, but expect the worst.
And then other times too, we've had vendors come in, like especially it's more common with the BMS systems where vendors will have a little more control of servers. It may not be my team doing the work. We let a vendor into one of the servers remotely because they're doing a software upgrade. And a few times we got the call, hey, we blew up this server. You have to restore it. So guess what? Those servers we back up nightly. So we lost maybe a morning of some building data, but that risk was acceptable. We accepted the risk. We got hit with the ramifications of that risk, but it was minimal, and we restored the servers and moved on with our daily activities.
So the biggest risk for people is not necessarily even the disaster. It's not planning for it, really.
Well, it's the planning for it. Whenever you could plan for, when there's a higher potential of a disaster or something negative happening, you plan appropriately. As long as you do that, most of the issues are not from the actual disasters. However, if we didn't plan for the Hurricane Sandys, for the power outages, if we didn't plan for those type of disasters, we would be in much bigger trouble. And they happen. You never know when they're gonna happen. Just because one happens doesn't mean you're good for the next 10 years.
Right. That's so true. Well, we already had a hurricane that wiped everything out. We don't need to worry about it.
And if you're from the Northeast, ironically, you had a Hurricane Irene less than a year before Hurricane Sandy. Hurricane Irene was devastating. That took out power. That took out systems. It's crazy. But we had those two hurricanes within a year of each other, and they both affected my company. Yeah,
now, you've been doing this for a long time. You've been doing IT for like close to 30 years. So you know what to do. You know what to think ahead for. You know what could happen and how that can impact a business because you have the experience. But what about a new person in IT handed an environment and maybe they have one person that's on their team and this is all new to them? What's the best advice that you could give someone in that situation?
Well, think about it, plan for it, do something, budget for it, and then guess what? Test it. see how you're going to do in the real disaster. We did tests. It's not, people thought of what the test would be. Sometimes we said, here, this is what we're going to do next week. Here's what's going to happen. Other times it's like, okay, we're going to have a disaster recovery drill. You'll find out at the time what's wrong. We're not going to tell you beforehand. Let's see how you handle it. So.
Yeah.
And also, a lot of times your systems, I mentioned some past experiences, your systems are tested unknowingly. When the BMS vendor blows up a server and you have to restore it in the middle of the business day, well, guess what? Did you restore it? Okay, your plan is good. It's real live. It's happening in real time, but in hindsight, you look at it as a test. You're like, yes, I had to go down. We recovered. Our backups are good. So,
And then you can look at that as what did we do good? What could we do better if this happens
yeah,
again? And take it as a learning experience. Yeah. Interestingly
absolutely.
enough, Arctic Wolf, they have a cybersecurity assessment tool. It's framed to NIST 2.0, and it has a built-in ability to create a disaster recovery plan at no cost. So for companies that maybe have someone that doesn't know how to do this, they haven't done it before, and they need some guidance on that, they can actually access that through ProTech. So if they go to our website, protechit.com, right on the front page, it'll say, get access to this free cybersecurity assessment tool. And they can either go on there and it's self-guided, or we can guide them with it. But it's a good way to be able to, if you don't know where to start, it can help you figure out like what's the starting point and take those steps to get something in place if you've not done it before.
Yeah, I highly recommend something like that. A lot of times there's hands-on activities where you could actually see and see how you perform in a real disaster. So you have to having a small IT department, especially if you have a less experienced person and you rely on one or two people. They don't know. They might be great employees, but you can't count on them to know everything, to be able to plan for everything. So it's important to have a vendor behind you. There's a lot at stake. So it's not. It's important to have the backup to feel protected and really be protected.
Yeah.
The feeling alone is not enough. You
No, the
have to
feeling
really
is
be
definitely
protected.
not enough on its own, right? But that's
Yeah.
a good point, and I've seen that a lot. Someone who's in IT and they're expected to just be an expert at everything, and it's not possible,
It's not.
and then their performance is unfairly judged because they're expected to manage everything. Well, you're IT. You should be able to do it, but you've got to give your team and your people the resources that are necessary in order for them to do their job.
Yeah, yeah, and then and if you're outside of IT, you never realize how much there is, how many different systems, and the poor IT person on the back end. It's not like their hands are in every system every day, and they keep up their knowledge of every system. A lot of times, there's systems that they don't touch for months, and they have to go back to and say, "Hey, oh wow, how do I do this? Where do I go again?" So that's important, for the DR plan. You need a real procedure, step by step, to lay it out, every step that would happen for system recoveries. So that becomes a huge document, and you have to keep it up. You have to review it at least every year, for any, and you need to go to it whenever you make any changes on the network. Whenever you're adding servers or systems, you have to add to it. You have to, again, go back to the business periodically and assess the importance, the criticality of it. You should have a matrix with criticality ratings of each system. And, so what the priorities are to restore, what to put the budget behind, which systems need that near real time data backups or just can be backed up every night.
If your environment is changing and you're not documenting it on the plan, and things change because a lot can change in a year.
Yep.
We haven't looked at it, we haven't updated it, then we have a disaster, we pull out this disaster recovery plan, but it's applicable to what we had in place last year, and that's not our current environment anymore.
Exactly. It should be, actually, what I do is in your server build list. You build your server, you put on your EDR software, you put on whatever software you have running internally at your company that needs to be on every server. You do what you're doing. The end is make sure it's backed up, assess when it needs to be backed up, and make sure it's in your disaster recovery plan with instructions how to recover. That's all part of each server build. It's not just
Yeah.
loading a Windows server and saying, okay, we're done.
And also being sure that everybody knows where this disaster recovery plan lives in the event, to your point earlier, what if somebody's out? And like, oh, well, I don't know, Mike put that disaster recovery plan in place, but I don't know where it is. Like everybody should know where it is and have a copy of it at all times, because you never
Yeah,
know what quarter of your team you're going to be able to reach. And if you can't reach
exactly.
the person who has that plan, you've got a major problem.
Yeah, and that plan has to be off-site as well. It has to be
Right.
accessible if something happens to your main site. It has to be, you can't just keep it as a document on the network and then all of a sudden not be able to get to your network. So,
Yeah.
yeah, so you have to take that all into account.
Well, I definitely appreciate the insight. It's been a good conversation.
Anytime, Melissa, it's great talking to you.
You too. Thanks, Mike.